Darrell Brooks. That's where this story begins. A red SUV plowed straight into a Christmas parade, tearing through the crowd as easily as a blade through paper. And for the people of Waukesha, Wisconsin, that fateful date of November 21st, 2021, permanently twisted their hometown celebration into a national tragedy. 39 years old, that was Brooks's age when he decided to floor the gas, driving right into a Sunday afternoon sea of families, dancers, and little kids. Turbulence and conflict, that was his life long before this horrific turning point ever happened. Raised in Milwaukee without a father, Brooks grappled with severe mental instability from his earliest years. 12 years old was all he was when a psychiatric hospitalization left him with a bipolar disorder diagnosis. Dropping out of high school followed shortly after, the moment he caught his first felony charge as a junior. 2 years in prison, that was his sentence for a 1999 aggravated battery conviction, kicking off a downward spiral that would span over 2 decades. Multiple counties bore the brunt of his rap sheet, a rap sheet that just kept growing. Domestic abuse, intimidation, reckless endangerment, and bail jumping. Those were the charges piling up against him. Middle age arrived, and Brooks was notorious as a loose cannon who despised authority and ignored consequences. Days before the parade, a violent altercation with his ex-girlfriend exploded in a Milwaukee parking lot. Reports say he actually ran her over with his car, yet absurdly low bail set him free, leading to that fateful November morning when he drove into Waukesha, triggering a horror that unfolded with blinding speed. Free to drive to Waukesha that November morning, what happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Just before 1 in the afternoon, Brooks yanked the wheel of his Ford Escape and swerved right onto the Main Street parade route. Smashing through barricades, he accelerated directly into the marching crowd. Cold and blank, that was the expression officers on the scene saw in his eyes as he ignored their desperate screams to stop, never once hitting the brakes. Zigzagging through the panic, he struck victim after victim in a pattern prosecutors later deemed completely intentional. 62 people suffered injuries, many of them left with wounds that altered their lives forever. 6 lives ended that day. Among the fallen was 8-year-old Jackson Sparks, marching proudly with his baseball team. 4 beloved members of the Milwaukee Dancing Grannies perished too: Virginia Sorensen, Leanna Owen, Tamara Durand, and Wilhelm Hospel, whose wife survived the attack. The 6th victim, Jayme Closs, was simply enjoying the festivities. Every single one of them was celebrating a community tradition, looking forward to the holidays, only to have their lives brutally stolen. Hours later, police captured Brooks near the end of the parade route, right by the vehicle he had abandoned. Handcuffs snapped on, and he offered no resistance at all, though the evidence against him was already overwhelming. Surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and his own recorded interrogation statements locked the case tight. Yet, as justice moved in, Brooks chose a bizarre, confrontational self-representation strategy that turned his trial into absolute chaos. Facing 76 charges, including 6 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, his initial move was a bogus insanity plea. But right before the October 2022 trial date, he abruptly changed course. Firing his public defenders, he demanded to represent himself, a request Judge Jennifer Dorow granted, unleashing unprecedented courtroom drama in Wisconsin history. Month-long proceedings became a circus as Brooks constantly disrupted the courtroom, refusing to acknowledge his own name, interrupting the judge, badgering victims during cross-examination, and rambling about sovereign citizen legal theories. He derailed the trial at every turn. Authority was something he claimed the court lacked entirely, challenging every rule and even stripping off his shirt in protest. Banished from the courtroom dozens of times by Judge Dorow, he spent much of his trial in an adjacent room. Video feeds kept him connected, though his microphone was constantly muted to cut off his shouting matches. Prosecutors built an airtight case, with District Attorney Susan Opper hammering home that Brooks had endless chances to stop, to steer away, to avoid the crowd entirely. Those choices were right there, but he chose to accelerate instead. Witness after witness recalled the horror of people flying through the air, the speeding vehicle, and the screams echoing down Main Street. Acting as his own lawyer, Brooks offered a pathetic defense, rambling about a vehicle malfunction and insisting he never meant to hurt anyone. Concluding the trial, his closing arguments focused purely on begging for jury nullification, a desperate final play that failed completely. Ultimately, not a single coherent explanation ever left his mouth. Then came October 26, 2022. Barely 3 hours of deliberation was all it took for the jury to return guilty verdicts on all 76 counts. Dead silence fell over Brooks as he sat with his head in his hands, listening to the word guilty echo repeatedly through the courtroom, a total defeat by the prosecution that meant mandatory life sentences for every single soul he took. 2 full days in mid-November were dedicated entirely to the emotional sentencing hearings. 45 victims and grieving family members stood up through tears and choking sobs, recounting the permanent psychological scars Brooks's atrocities had carved into their lives as traumatized children spoke of nightmares and a sudden, terrifying dread of cars. Parents painfully relived the horror of watching their babies get mowed down, while one young dancer told the court she lost a piece of her soul that day and was still desperately trying to find it. Brooks's own family testified too, with his mother and grandmother pleading for leniency so he could receive mental health treatment, heavily emphasizing his lifelong uphill battle with psychological illness since childhood. Judge Darrell flatly rejected insanity as an excuse, noting that 4 psychological experts evaluated Brooks and diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, not a mental defect that would clear him of legal responsibility for such calculated cruelty. Perfectly aware of right and wrong. That's what the judge insisted Brooks was, stating he simply let rage and malice override his conscience. November 16, 2022 was the day Judge Darrell handed down the absolute maximum penalty. 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole went to Brooks for the murders, plus an additional 762.5 years for the remaining charges. Choosing evil, that's how she described his actions to his face, declaring that the world would only be safe with him rotting behind bars for the rest of his natural life. Behind bars in a maximum security prison is where Darrell Brooks sits today, transferred out of Wisconsin to an out-of-state facility. Multiple extensions to appeal his conviction have been filed, but no miracles are waiting for him. Infamy secures his name as one of Wisconsin's most brutal mass murderers, while the resilient community of Waukesha continues to heal, united under the banner of Waukesha Strong. Quietly unfolding in another corner of the state, however, was a completely different kind of horror, proving that monstrosities don't just lurk in crowded public squares sometimes. The most savage crimes happen right behind closed doors. Taylor Schabusiness. That's the focus of our second story. February 23, 2022, was the fateful day Tara Picanage walked down her basement stairs in Green Bay, freezing in terror at a sight no mother should ever have to witness. Her son's severed head resting in a bucket covered by a towel, courtesy of 25-year-old Taylor Schabusiness, the woman responsible for one of the most barbaric mutilation murders in recent Wisconsin history. Born Taylor Coronado, she grew up in a highly turbulent home and lost her mother at a young age, a massive trauma her family claims completely warped her personality, sending her into a downward spiral of addiction and mental instability. Cycling through relationships and running into trouble with the law became her norm. 2 years old was the age of her child by early 2022, though social services had removed the infant from her custody immediately after birth. Methamphetamine smoke and a string of disastrous choices defined her aimless existence, culminating in an act of unforgivable savagery. 24-year-old victim Shad Therian, by contrast, was a quiet, gentle soul living with his mother in Green Bay. He and Schabusiness knew each other from their school days, entangled in a toxic, on-again, off-again relationship bound together by heavy meth use and reckless behavior. Dusk on February 21st was when Schabusiness picked Therian up from his mother's house, grabbing a mutual friend along the way. Smoking marijuana at an Eastman Avenue apartment started their night. But once the friend left, Schabusiness and Therian switched to meth and recklessly injected trazodone, a heavy sedative they abused purely to chase an extreme high. Returning to the Picanage home while Shad's mother and her partner were out, they headed down to the dark basement to indulge in twisted fantasies that Schabusiness later described to detectives as rough sex, involving bondage and strangulation for erotic pleasure. Metal chains were in her hands when she began choking him, But instead of letting go when Therian started struggling for air, cold-bloodedly, she kept tightening the grip for 3 to 5 minutes, suffocating him until blood pooled from his mouth and his life slipped away. Chilling even the most seasoned investigators, her subsequent behavior defied explanation. Instead of dialing 911 or sprinting from the scene, hours were spent by Schabusiness calmly lingering beside Therian's corpse, engaging in acts prosecutors later branded as pure desecration. Kitchen knives were what she grabbed the following morning, casually starting to dismember his remains. Positioning the torso over a bucket and a plastic tote to catch the blood, she let it drain straight into the basement shower vent. Organs were ripped out next, stuffed into plastic bags and cardboard boxes scattered carelessly across the floor. Tossing several body parts into her gold pickup truck, she finally left, right before Therian's mother returned in the early hours of February 23rd, sensing something was terribly wrong. Rushing down to check the basement, the poor woman froze upon discovering the bucket holding her son's severed head and matching remains. Minutes later, arriving officers encountered a scene that went far beyond any human imagination. Bags stuffed with human organs and body parts littered the house, showcasing a chillingly methodical dismemberment process. Launching an immediate manhunt, police cornered Schabusiness later that day at an apartment complex on Eastman Avenue. Dried blood completely covered her clothes, a fresh cut marked her thumb, and scratches lined her arm's wounds she dismissed as self-inflicted. Locked up immediately, she faced counts of first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and third-degree sexual assault. Sitting in the interrogation room, Schabusiness let loose to detectives, matter-of-factly detailing her sick, twisted actions while boastfully claiming a spiritual connection to Jeffrey Dahmer, Milwaukee's infamous serial killer, disregarding the glaring fact that Dahmer had been dead and buried for nearly 30 years. Total detachment from reality characterized her statements, a thread her defense lawyers later tried to spin into an insanity defense. September 22 saw her legal team officially file a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. Yet courtroom proceedings kept stalling due to Schabusiness's volatile behavior, exploding on February 14, 2023. Right during a scheduling hearing, she violently lunged at her own attorney, Quinn Jolly, in broad daylight. Courtroom cameras caught her tackling the lawyer before a deputy wrestled her to the floor. An outburst followed by jail guard attacks, forcing authorities to put a spit hood over her head during subsequent appearances. Two distinct phases shaped the trial that followed. July 2023 was when the jury first deliberated whether she actually committed the murder. A question, answered with lightning speed, as a guilty verdict dropped on all counts after less than an hour of deliberation. Phase 2 pivoted strictly to her mental capacity, with the defense arguing meth-induced psychosis and chronic mental illness, rendered her incapable of distinguishing right from wrong at the moment of the crime. Forensic experts from both sides squared off, debating whether her drug-fueled state combined with underlying conditions met Wisconsin's strict legal definition of insanity. Prosecutors instantly fired back, highlighting her deliberate actions right after the killing, from tidying up the scene and hiding evidence to packing away the body parts, proving she knew exactly how vile her actions were. Clear and conscious, her recorded confession videos exposed a killer fully aware of the consequences of her deeds. Siding with the state, the jury took under an hour to conclude she was perfectly sane when she took his life. September 26, 2023, brought the final sentencing, marked by tearful impact statements from Therian's family. Grace was chosen by some, like the victim's father, Michael, who remarked that everyone stumbles and hoped the killer would find redemption. Mercy was out of the question for others, notably his uncle Kelly, who openly prayed she'd meet the same horrific end as her idol Jeffrey Dahmer. Transcending description, that's how Judge Thomas Walsh labeled the atrocity, affirming the entire community felt deeply shaken by such an absolute assault on human dignity. Desperately trying to soften the blow, Schabusiness's lawyer argued she wasn't a monster, and at 25, still had time to rebuild her life. Offered a chance to speak, Schabusiness merely muttered a cold, "No, there's no way." Instantly, the judge handed down a life sentence without parole for the murder, tacking on an extra 10.5 consecutive years for corpse mutilation and sexual assault. Life behind bars meant freedom's door had officially slammed shut forever. Still confined to maximum security today, Schabusiness remains isolated, continuing her patterns of unhinged, violent outbursts. Another conviction hit her in late 2024 for a savage attack on a jail guard, though her lawyers keep desperately filing appeals. Dead ends are all those appeals ever hit, leaving her case as one of the most bone-chilling legal sagas in Wisconsin history. A grim reminder it stands, proving that even a state accustomed to shocking violence can witness savagery that shatters human comprehension. Barely had the curtains closed on Schabusiness's trial when investigators quietly reopened an old murder file from years back. A former police officer sat at the center of this horrific file, a man who'd kept a monstrous secret buried for far too long. Stephen Zelich anchors our third story, starting on June 15, 2014, when highway workers on a desolate Walworth County road stumbled onto a sight that had haunted them for years. Foul-smelling and buzzing with flies, 2 discarded suitcases lay abandoned right there in a roadside ditch. 12 years, that's how long Stephen Mark Zelich proudly wore a police badge in the Milwaukee suburb of West Allis, Wisconsin. Completely unremarkable to neighbors and colleagues alike, he seemed like just another quiet, middle-aged guy. Reclusive and holding a steady job, he hid a double life online behind the username Mr. Handcuffs, immersing himself in dark sadomasochism communities. Bondage and physical domination were his fix, and cruising those dark web chat rooms was how he hunted for vulnerable victims. 2 tragic women paid with their lives for trusting him, starting with 19-year-old Jennifer Gamil from Cottage Grove, Oregon, a girl who'd spent most of her youth bouncing through foster care. Locked away in prison was her mother, while her father vanished entirely into Mexico, yet she still managed to graduate valedictorian at an alternative high school, earning a community college scholarship before she unfortunately crossed paths with Zelich online. Grooming her on an adult site began when she was just 16, with months of messaging before he reconnected the moment she turned 18. Luring her sweet-talked self to Wisconsin in August 2012, he promised a shared home where she'd live as his submissive partner. Eagerly, the teenager hit the road, everything she owned packed into one solitary suitcase. Turning a fresh page in life was what she expected, not knowing Zelich would lock her in a Kenosha County hotel room for days, forcing twisted acts he called consensual thrill-seeking. Then came their final morning before checkout, when everything took a fatal turn. Pinning her down, he used handcuffs, a blindfold, and a ball gag before looping a heavy rope around her neck to start a dangerous choking game. An oxygen-depriving stranglehold that Zelich later shamelessly claimed was a consensual, prearranged deal between them. Tightening and loosening the cord repeatedly, according to what he later told detectives, this sick game with the poor girl's airway dragged on, each strangulation lasting longer than the last. Coldly, he finally refused to let go, holding the squeeze until Jennifer collapsed, choked on blood, and died within minutes. Dismissing it as a mere accident that went too far was Zelich's defense, but prosecutors smashed that excuse, pointing out his professional academy training. Fully certified in CPR and advanced life-saving first aid, he didn't lift a single finger to resuscitate her. Shoving her lifeless corpse into the very suitcase she'd brought from Oregon, he tossed it into his trunk and casually drove home to his West Allis apartment, where he cleaned out his kitchen refrigerator and stashed her body inside for over a year. Keeping Jenny Gammel's body in his kitchen fridge didn't disrupt his daily routine at all. He went to work, slept, and lived with that horrific evidence right beside him until 15 months later, in November 2013, when he went hunting online again, connecting with 37-year-old Laura Jean Simonson from Farmington, Minnesota, who, like his previous victim, sought connection in the same fetish circles. Luring her to a Rochester hotel room, he spun fantasies of taking her back to Wisconsin so they could spend their lives together. Hiding a monstrous truth, though, his home refrigerator was already holding the rotting remains of his first victim. Over their 24-hour stay at that Rochester hotel, his horrific script played out exactly the same, using handcuffs, duct tape, a blindfold, and a gag to leave Simonson utterly helpless and unable to resist. That final morning saw him resort to his fatal breath play trick again, wrapping a cord around her neck while she knelt blindfolded on the mattress. replicating his previous murder step by step. He pulled the cord taut until her breathing stopped, later dusting off the exact same accident excuse, claiming it was just a mishap when rough play turned lethal, before cramming Laura's body into her own suitcase and heading back to Wisconsin. Stashing her body right next to Jenny's in his home was what he did next. But by June 2014, with 2 corpses on his hands, action became unavoidable for Zelich. Shoving both suitcases into his trunk, he drove straight to a remote highway stretch in Walworth County. Tossing them carelessly into a ditch, he simply drove away, leaving a horrific discovery for road maintenance crews that instantly triggered a massive investigation. Asphyxiation and severe neck trauma, those were the causes of death revealed by both autopsies. Dental records and fingerprints were the only ways police managed to identify the 2 women. Months earlier, when Minnesota police first investigated Simonson's disappearance, they actually knocked on Zelich's door to question him, but he slyly lied right to their faces, claiming he had no clue who she was and hadn't seen her in months. Surveillance footage from the Rochester hotel shattered that alibi entirely, clearly capturing Zelich and Simonson checking in together. Call logs, internet searches, and eyewitness testimony cornered him with unassailable concrete evidence. August 2014 brought the handcuffs, with authorities charging him in Wisconsin with first-degree intentional homicide for Gamel's death, followed by second-degree murder charges in Minnesota for taking Simonson's life. Defending Zelich, his lawyers tried desperately to frame the deaths as tragic accidents during extreme, consensual rough sex, highlighting his lack of prior violent record. His cooperation with detectives and his supposed remorse was their main angle. Prosecutors unmasked a completely different beast, a calculated internet predator stalking vulnerable women online, using empty promises of care and a shared home to trap them, then killing them during twisted encounters to satisfy his need for absolute control. Target selection was deliberate, argued Kenosha County Deputy District Attorney Michael Gravely, noting Zelich picked victims lacking strong family ties or close social networks, women whose sudden disappearance wouldn't immediately raise red flags. Hiding the bodies, lying to police, and hunting for fresh prey online right after each murder proved he knew exactly what he was doing, meaning accident or mistake was completely out of the question. Hunting for fresh prey online right after each murder proved he knew exactly what he was doing, meaning accident or mistake was completely out of the question. Pleading guilty to first-degree reckless homicide for Gamel's death in January 2016, Zelich faced Judge Bruce Schroeder on March 30, 2016, who handed down a 35-year sentence, bluntly branding the crime a monstrosity with disgusting details. Rejecting all pleas for leniency, the judge exposed a sickening truth. Even after killing Gamel, Zelich kept hunting online, actively trying to recruit another woman to be his lifetime sex slave. Right around the time he dumped those suitcases, that's when he was seeking his next captive. February 2017 brought an additional 25-year sentence from a Minnesota court for murdering Simonson. Tacked onto his punishment for hiding the bodies, 70 years became Zelich's total prison time, requiring him to serve over 58 years before even tasting a chance at parole. Given his age at sentencing, this outcome amounts to a practical life term. Turning 80-something is his earliest possible exit date, assuming he even survives that long. Rotting behind bars is where Stephen Zelich remains today. A chilling warning, his name stands as proof that predators can hide perfectly behind a police badge, a computer screen, or a polite mask, trapping victims before they ever realize it's too late. Yet, while Zelich's interstate crimes sent shockwaves through the public, another massive Wisconsin case was about to grip the entire nation, a story of a resilient little girl whose fierce bravery would inspire millions. Jake Patterson anchors our fourth story. Through the freezing darkness of a January night in rural Wisconsin, a 13-year-old girl ran barefoot through the snow, wearing only pajamas and oversized sneakers, pure panic driving her search for help. That spectacular escape brought a definitive end to one of the most intensive missing child searches in American history. 21 years old, that was Jake Thomas Patterson's age on the night of October 15, 2018, when he hit the Closs home in Barron County with a 12-gauge shotgun and a thoroughly rehearsed kidnapping plan. Quiet and aimless, that's how those who knew Patterson described him, a young guy struggling to find his footing after high school who briefly enlisted in the Marines, only to get kicked out of boot camp after a mere 5 weeks. Bouncing between jobs from cheese factories to pheasant processing plants, he ended up living off his parents in the small town of Gordon, roughly 70 miles north of Barron County. An introverted bookworm. That's how former classmates remembered him, someone who seemed more lost in life than dangerous or volatile. Yet beneath that bland, harmless exterior, Patterson harbored sick fantasies of abducting and locking someone away. His obsessive fixation on 13-year-old Jayme Closs began entirely by chance. Early October, that morning he was just driving to a temporary job. Stopping behind a school bus right by the Closs house, Patterson watched young Jayme step aboard. Instantly marking her as his prey, he later confessed to investigators, though he knew absolutely nothing about the family. Never had he laid eyes on her before, knowing nothing but what he glimpsed from that brief roadside glance. Capturing Jayme became his obsession from that fateful moment, driving him to map out a meticulous plan over the following days. Twice, he stalked the house that month, backing off only because driveway cars or indoor lights signaled life inside. Shaving his head and face completely, he took extreme care to avoid dropping a single shred of forensic evidence. Duct tape, rope, and his father's shotgun. That was the chilling toolkit he assembled. Just past 1 in the morning on October 15th, his final visit woke 56-year-old Jayme Closs to frantic dog barking. Peering through the front door glass, his flashlight beam caught a dark figure looming outside. Demanding to see a badge, Jayme mistook him for law enforcement, but Patterson just barked profanities, ordering him to open up. Hesitation from Jayme was met with a shotgun blast right through the glass, killing him instantly. Gunfire sent Jayme and her mother, Denise, scrambling into the bathroom, where the terrified mother shielded her daughter in a tight embrace. Kicking the door off its hinges, Patterson bound Jayme's wrists and ankles with tape and muffled her screams. Leveling the shotgun at 46-year-old Denise Closs, he coldly executed her before dragging Jayme out and tossing her into his trunk. Minutes were all the brutal assault took, and as Patterson accelerated into the pitch-black night, a massive manhunt ignited immediately, launching a grueling months-long search involving hundreds of officers across multiple jurisdictions. Amber alerts blanketed the region while volunteers flooded streets with flyers, and the FBI joined local police to track every single tip. No witnesses, no camera footage, and zero apparent motive left investigators completely empty-handed. Struggling to find a suspect, detectives had no idea Patterson was hiding Jayme right under their noses at a remote Gordon cabin. Hiding perfectly from authorities, he forced her to crawl under his twin bed whenever visitors stopped by. Even his own father's routine Saturday visits meant Patterson would barricade the bed's exit with heavy plastic weight totes. 12 continuous hours under that cramped frame left the poor girl trapped without food, water, or bathroom breaks. Blasting loud music to drown out any sound she might make, he dictated her entire existence whenever they were alone. Controlling when she ate, slept, or even spoke. He threatened unthinkable horrors if she ever dared to run. 88 days of this living nightmare dragged on until January 10th, 2019, when Patterson made his fatal slip. Leaving for a few hours to apply at a superior liquor distributor, he told her he'd be gone. Seizing her golden opportunity, Jayme shoved the weights aside, crawled out, threw on Patterson's sneakers, and bolted. Into the bitter Wisconsin winter she ran, sprinting blindly through the snow until she ran into a neighbor walking her dog. Gene Nutter was that neighbor, who immediately rushed the girl to the nearby home of Kristen and Peter Kaczynskis. Pounding on their door, she screamed that this was Jayme Closs and ordered them to call 911 immediately. Minutes later, police spotted Patterson's car and forced him over, meeting zero resistance as he surrendered on the spot. "I know what you're here for. I did it," he casually told them, kickstarting a chillingly fast and detailed confession. Admitting everything from that initial sighting to the double murder and brutal captivity, he showed zero genuine remorse. Offering only a hollow shrug that what he did was wrong, he faced 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide and kidnapping. Exposure of his heinous crimes to the public was exactly what the upcoming legal process promised. March 2019 saw him plead guilty to everything to avoid a trial, a move his lawyer claimed was to spare Jayme further trauma. Walking out of the courtroom that very day, however, he spun around and yelled, "Bye, Jayme." a chilling parting shot proving his sick, obsessive fixation hadn't faded one bit. May 24th, 2019 brought the final sentencing, where her attorney stood to read a powerful letter on absent Jayme's behalf. Thinking he could own me was his first mistake. I was much smarter than him, the brave girl firmly stated through her attorney. Watching his routine was how I planned my escape, and I got my freedom back. I'll be free forever, but he never will. Tearful impact statements followed from her family, recounting the permanent psychological toll carved into Jayme's youth, alongside the agonizing grief of losing both parents in one brutal night. Huntington was exactly what Patterson would do if he ever got out, argued Barron County District Attorney Brian Wright, insisting that public safety demanded a permanent cell for this predator, with no chance of ever breathing free air again. Pure evil. That's what Judge James Babler called Patterson, labeling the abduction the most horrifying and calculated atrocity of his entire judicial career. 2 consecutive life terms without parole were handed down for the murders, plus an extra 40 years for the kidnapping. Leaving no room for doubt, the judge promised Patterson would rot in a cage for the rest of his natural life, deprived of any opportunity to step foot in the outside world again. Shipped out of Wisconsin to a New Mexico prison, Patterson immediately started getting into violent altercations with other inmates. Multiple appeals have been launched from his cell, but 0 miracles are waiting to save him. Healing and rebuilding her life became Jayme's focus, backed by the fierce love of her relatives and neighbors. Becoming a powerful advocate for missing and exploited children, she channeled her unimaginable trauma into a lifelong mission to rescue others enduring similar horrors. Behind bars is where Jake Patterson sits today, his name forever tied to one of the most savage abductions in Wisconsin history, a chilling reminder that monsters don't need a complex motive, just a chance encounter and a sick, twisted desire for absolute control. Yet, while Jayme's incredible resilience offered a glimmer of hope to the state, a completely different mystery was quietly unraveling in another rural pocket of Wisconsin, proving how years of hidden lies can spark a bloody end. Cindy Schultz Judes anchors our 5th story, peaceful and quiet. That's how the Dill Creek farm looked on a warm August morning in 2006, but inside, Kenneth Judes lay dead in his bed from 2 shotgun blasts, a profane note pinned right next to his body with a knife. 58 years old, Ken was a deeply respected pharmacist running the show at the Memorial Medical Center in Medford, Wisconsin. Vibrant, warm, and giving, that's how friends described him, the kind of guy whose mere presence could brighten up any room he walked into. Finding love again with Cindy Schultz followed a difficult divorce from his first wife, Betty, marrying her in 2004 after a whirlwind romance that everyone assumed was completely genuine. Attached at the hip, they were always holding hands and laughing, projecting an image of pure bliss that made onlookers say, "Nobody can possibly be that happy." Making their home at the Dill Creek farm in the town of Hull, Marathon County, they ran the Monster Hall racetrack and campground together, making their partnership look picture-perfect from the outside. Picture Perfect exploded on August 30th, 2006, when a hysterical Cindy called police from a neighbor's house. Sobbing that she just found Ken dead in their bedroom, she begged dispatchers to send help immediately. Arriving deputies walked right into a grim scene. Ken's naked body bore shotgun wounds to his back and chest, while that chilling note was pinned to the mattress with a knife. Dripping with hatred and malice, the vulgar words scrawled on the paper seemed designed to send a message, or perhaps to serve as a calculated smokescreen to throw off the scent, which one investigator later called the strangest piece of evidence he'd ever seen. Severe sinus trouble was Cindy's immediate alibi, claiming she slept outside in a small camper because she didn't want her coughing to wake Ken. Waking up around 8:30 that morning, she walked inside only to find him cold, a story that instantly triggered red flags for investigators. Choosing a cramped, unair-conditioned trailer on a sweltering, humid August night made 0 sense to seasoned detectives. Furthermore, why was the farm's entire surveillance system suddenly turned off? Why were the doors unlocked? And why were their foster kids sent away that exact night? Days passed, and more disturbing anomalies cropped up. Right after Ken's funeral, Cindy eagerly produced a will naming herself the sole heir, a move that left Ken's family completely shell-shocked. He had children from his previous marriage, and cutting them out entirely for a woman he'd known for less than 3 years seemed completely out of character. Forgery was their immediate suspicion, but what looked even worse was Cindy racing to collect on a life insurance policy worth nearly $1 million. Money. That was the glaringly obvious motive staring investigators and the family right in the face. Suspicions ran deep, yet the case ground to a halt without a murder weapon or any solid forensic evidence. No charges could be filed by prosecutors, completely hamstrung by the lack of ironclad evidence tying Cindy to the crime. A mere suspect she remained, leaving the file to gather dust for 13 long years while she lived her life scotangent-free. Loudly proclaiming her innocence, she even had the audacity to blame the police for not finding the real killer. Giving up wasn't an option for Marathon County Detective Dennis Blazer, who officially took over the cold case years later. Meticulously combing through every detail, he re-interviewed witnesses and hunted relentlessly for any fresh lead. Payoff came in late 2019, when investigators unearthed an old statement from her ex-husband about a 20-gauge shotgun gifted to her years prior. Overlooked in earlier sweeps, that single golden nugget changed everything. Chillingly emotionless. That's how new witnesses described Cindy's detached attitude around the time of Ken's death. Victory felt certain for the state by December 2019, over 13 years after the murder. Arrested at last, Cindy Schultz Judes faced charges of party to first-degree intentional homicide and obstructing justice. 66 years old when the cuffs snapped on, that massive delay became her defense team's primary weapon. Questioning the state's sudden discovery of sufficient evidence after so long was their main angle. October 2021 brought the trial, where prosecutors unmasked her as a gold digger driven by pure greed. Marrying Ken for his money, she ruthlessly orchestrated his execution just to pocket his assets and that life insurance payout. Total inside knowledge, she had the tools, the motive, and knew every square inch of that farm. Controlling who stayed home that night and possessing easy weapon access, she stood to gain everything from his demise. Killing the surveillance cameras and shipping off the foster kids exposed a highly calculated plot. Sleeping in that sweltering camper was nothing but a calculated smokescreen to manufacture a perfect alibi. Claiming total ignorance of the attack, her defense fired back that the state's case relied entirely on baseless speculation. No murder weapon existed, nor was there any forensic proof showing Cindy ever pulled the trigger. 0 eyewitnesses placed her at the scene, leading her team to argue that 13 years of digging yielded absolutely nothing. Innocent, that's what they claimed she was, trying to shift the blame onto other potential suspects instead. Grudges and business disputes involving the racetrack were highlighted, pointing to other enemies Ken might have made. Taking the stand herself, Cindy wept and swore up and down how deeply she loved her husband. Smashed by the prosecution, her theatrical grief crumbled before evidence of her chillingly detached behavior post-murder. Greedily grabbing his assets without shedding a single genuine tear, she earned a stinging rebuke from Judge Michael Moran for her cold-blooded cruelty. October 21, 2021, saw the jury find Cindy Schultz Judes guilty of party to first-degree intentional homicide and obstructing justice. June 2022 brought the hammer down. Life without parole, that was the definitive sentence handed down by Judge Moran. Condemning her calculated cruelty, the judge blasted the ultimate betrayal of a husband who trusted her completely. Building a life together meant nothing to her, answering his love with a brutal shotgun blast. Sent straight to Taycheedah Correctional Institution, her life term finally brought closure to Ken's family after 15 long years. Justice took over 15 years to arrive, but this dark saga had one final, twisted turn left. July 19, 2023, was when prison guards discovered Cindy unresponsive and blue on her cell floor. Bludgeoned by her 28-year-old cellmate Taylor Sanchez, who'd gone off her psychiatric medication, she was left for dead. 68 years old, Cindy succumbed to those catastrophic injuries from the beating. Convicted of murder in July 2025, Sanchez received another mandatory life sentence without parole. Defiant to her final breath, she never admitted her guilt, taking her dark secrets to the grave and ending all appeals forever. Misfortune piled upon misfortune for Ken's family, starting with the brutal murder of their loved one. A decade of waiting for justice followed, ending with the twisted irony of his killer being beaten to death behind bars. A haunting reminder this case remains. Closure doesn't always follow even when justice finally catches up. 13 years it took to expose that widow's lies, but another ungrateful son's facade in Wisconsin crumbled in mere days. Chandler Halderson anchors our sixth story, where a single Snapchat location ping became a fatal clue. Demolishing the 23-year-old's intricate web of lies, it exposed one of the most chilling, calculated familicides in Wisconsin history. A picture of success, that's what Chandler Michael Halderson seemed like in the summer of 2021, bragging to his parents, Bart and Krista, about finishing his renewable energy engineering degree at Madison Area Technical College. Working remotely for a major insurance company was another part of his big boast. Landing a prestigious gig at SpaceX made it sound even grander, you see. Moving to Florida with his girlfriend at the end of the month for Elon Musk's aerospace giant had his parents beaming with pride. A bright future awaited him, backed completely by parents who supported him throughout his pandemic stay at home. Pure fiction. That's what prosecutors later proved his life was, since Chandler actually dropped out during his very first semester. No insurance job and no Florida SpaceX position existed. Instead, he just hid in his room playing video games all day. Faking early morning wake-ups for imaginary online meetings, he completely fooled his work-from-home accountant father. Crafting fake emails from college officials, he spent months spinning a highly elaborate digital illusion. Forging transcripts and using burner numbers, he even impersonated staff on calls with his father, mind you. Late June 2021 was when this house of cards finally began to collapse. Frustrated by the school withholding his son's transcripts, Bart Halderson called the college himself, pretending to be Chandler. A harsh reality struck during that fateful call. The college administrators Chandler kept referencing didn't even exist. Expelled long ago, Chandler wasn't even on the student roster anymore. Well, that's the end of that. Were Bart's final recorded words, a heartbreaking realization after unmasking his son's lies. Scheduling a 3 p.m. meeting with the college for July 11th, Bart set a deadline Chandler knew would shatter his charade completely. Murder over accountability. That's what Chandler chose, according to prosecutors. Executing a horrific plan on the afternoon of July 11th. Shooting his 50-year-old father in the back with an SKS rifle from an online buddy, he struck right before that fateful meeting. Returning home a few hours later, his 53-year-old mother Krista met the exact same brutal fate. Dismembering both parents right in their family home, he spent the next few days in a horrific cleanup operation. Burning evidence in the family fireplace followed, where investigators later uncovered fragments of human skulls in the ash. Scattering remaining body parts across southern Wisconsin, he dumped pieces in roadside ditches and along riverbanks. Dumped in woods, rivers, and trash cans, he even had the nerve to ask to use his girlfriend's family farm pool, you see. Faking a leg injury to use their pool, his actual goal was sneaking into their woods to hide his father's upper torso. 6 days after the murders, July 17th was when Chandler finally strolled into the police station to report his parents missing. Fabrication was his move, telling police his parents drove to their Langlade County cabin with another couple for the 4th of July. Ghosting his own family, he even used his mother's phone to text himself, pretending she was still in touch to mislead them. Suggesting they might have stopped at a casino raised immediate red flags for investigators searching for clues, though. Thriftiness defined the Haldersons, who were famous for saving money and absolutely detested gambling, see. Suspicions centered fast on Chandler, with Detective Sabrina Sims noting his story totally clashed with his parents' usual habits. Digital footprints ultimately sealed his fate, courtesy of his own girlfriend, Catherine Melander. Secretly tracking his location via Snapchat maps because of his past cheating history, she inadvertently caught his movements. Claiming he was busy doing chores on July 13th, the app instead pinged him standing deep in remote woods along the Wisconsin River. Sensing something was terribly off, Melander immediately snapped a screenshot of his location right then. Dropping everything to search those exact coordinates, shocked investigators discovered the severed legs of Krista Halderson. Bart's upper torso was found scattered on the Melander family farm in Cottage Grove, roughly 20 miles from the Halderson home. Stunned, the farm owner told detectives she was highly surprised to see Chandler suddenly emerge from the edge of her wooded property. Scouring the area, police uncovered not only the rest of Bart's remains, but also a saw blade, shears, loppers, and a blood-soaked tarp containing DNA from both victims. An autopsy shattered any doubt, revealing Bart was shot at least twice in the back. Determining Krista's exact cause of death proved impossible, since authorities recovered nothing but her legs. Her head remains completely missing to this day, as mountains of fresh evidence unmasked a highly calculated murder plot. Quietly typing a digital note on his phone the very night after the murders, Chandler listed hydrogen peroxide, lemon, floor cleaning instructions, and most chillingly, the phrase "get a job." Gas station surveillance footage also caught him hauling heavy bags of ice. Preserving his father's body to hide the smell of decomposition was the purpose of that ice, prosecutors argued. Walking perfectly without the neck brace he claimed to need for an injury, the video completely demolished his physical alibi. Jailed immediately, Chandler faced 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, providing false information about missing persons, mutilating a corpse, and hiding a corpse. Pleading not guilty, he stood trial in January 2022. Spinning a web of lies of unimaginable proportions, Chandler killed his own parents just to keep his charade from ripping apart. Assistant District Attorney William Brown argued. Trying desperately to salvage his defense, his lawyers argued that being a liar, even a pathological one, didn't automatically make him a murderer, questioning how petty deception could escalate into such horrific violence. Unassailable evidence proved otherwise, and on January 20th, 2022, a brief deliberation ended with the jury convicting Chandler on all 8 counts. March was set for sentencing by Judge John Hyland, and at that March 17, 2022 hearing, prosecutor Andrea Raymond branded the case the absolute pinnacle of depravity, cruelty, and a complete lack of remorse. Growing up with every advantage, loving parents, and a supportive family who provided everything left him with 0 excuses, she pointed out, violence was entirely absent from his upbringing. Yet during a memorial service for the 2 victims, Chandler didn't shed a single tear of grief, cold-bloodedly telling a grieving relative after the service to just go home and watch the horror movie Halloween. He never spent a single day mourning his parents. Judge Hyland struggled to contain his emotion while addressing the sheer barbarity of the crime. Taking the lives of the people who brought him into this world wasn't enough, as he chose to butcher their bodies, lie to police, and strip them of their final dignity. The judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of extended supervision or early release, Wisconsin's absolute equivalent to life without parole. Ensuring the only way Chandler would ever leave prison would be in a coffin for burial was his explicit goal, the judge added. Giving up his family completely, Chandler Halderson remains rotting behind bars today to serve his life sentence. Launching an appeal from his cell hasn't brought him any miracles. That Snapchat location feature, built simply to connect friends, became the ultimate tool to unmask a horrific crime and bring justice for Bart and Krista Halderson, 2 parents whose only mistake was putting absolute faith in their ungrateful son. Yet, while Chandler's case shocked Wisconsin with its cold calculation, another legal battle had been burning for years, dividing an entire state and turning the global true crime world upside down. Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey anchor our 7th story. Halloween night 2005 was when photographer Teresa Halbach vanished into thin air after visiting a Manitowoc County salvage yard. What followed exploded into one of the most fiercely debated, high-profile cases in American legal history. 43 years old when Teresa vanished, Stephen Avery's bitter history with Wisconsin law enforcement actually started decades earlier. Back in 1985, Avery was wrongfully convicted of sexual assault and attempted murder, robbing him of 18 prime years for an atrocity he never committed before. DNA evidence finally exonerated him in 2003. Unmasking the actual perpetrator as a man named Gregory Allen, Avery's release sparked furious statewide debates over systemic corruption, cultivating a landmark criminal justice reform bill that became widely known as the Avery Task Force. Implementing strict safeguards to prevent similar tragic miscarriages of justice in the future was the goal. Following his exoneration, Avery slapped Manitowoc County with a massive $36 million civil lawsuit, explicitly naming former Sheriff Thomas Kokorek and former District Attorney Dennis Vogel for the decades of his youth they stole away. Progressing smoothly through the legal channels, the lawsuit was suddenly upended on October 31, 2005, when Teresa Halbach drove out to Avery's auto salvage yard to photograph a minivan for Auto Trader magazine, marking her final appointment of the day. Never seen alive again, her sudden disappearance triggered a missing persons report on November 3rd. Just 2 days later, finding her vehicle hidden right on the Avery property sent the investigation into overdrive. Over the next week, detectives uncovered her car key inside Stephen's trailer, his blood inside her vehicle, and charred human bone fragments in a burn pit near his back door, which were quickly identified as Teresa's remains. Reinforcing the state's case, a bullet fragment bearing Teresa's DNA was later discovered in Avery's garage. Mounting evidence seemed entirely unassailable, yet Avery fiercely maintained his innocence, claiming law enforcement framed him to destroy his multi-million-dollar civil suit. Deliberate planting of evidence was the core argument from his defense team, who pointed out several highly suspicious anomalies. Discovered by 2 Manitowoc County Sheriff's deputies explicitly named in Avery's lawsuit, the key appeared only after multiple thorough searches yielded absolutely nothing. Querying the source of his blood in Teresa's car, they argued it was taken from a secured 1985 blood vial sample kept in evidence, spurring fierce debates over whether that specific vial bore signs of tampering or a tiny puncture hole in the stopper. March 2007 brought an end to the 27-day trial, with the jury convicting Avery of first-degree intentional homicide and felon in possession of a firearm. Acquitted on a single charge of mutilating a corpse, he listened as Judge Patrick Willis handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Settling his civil lawsuit for a meager $400,000 while sitting behind bars was his only choice, a tiny fraction of what he originally sought. Yet this complex legal saga harbored a far more tragic and controversial angle. March 2006 was when Avery's 16-year-old nephew, Brendan Dassey, was charged as a co-defendant after giving a series of highly detailed confessions to investigators, claiming he helped his uncle commit the crime, telling detectives that he and Avery assaulted Teresa, bound her, and disposed of her body. Dassey laid out a devastating timeline. Videotaping the confession was mandatory, marking one of the very first major Wisconsin cases to use newly enacted juvenile interrogation recording laws. Retracting everything shortly after, Dassey insisted his confession was entirely coerced by investigators who interviewed him without a parent or attorney present, despite the teenager possessing a documented IQ scoring between 69 and 73. Feeding him facts and leading him to specific answers, detectives allegedly used false promises of leniency to secure his cooperation, his new attorneys argued. Zero physical evidence connected Dassey to any crime scene whatsoever. No DNA, no blood, and not a single fingerprint linked him to the murder. Yet a jury convicted him in April 2007 of party to first-degree intentional homicide, second-degree sexual assault, and mutilating a corpse. 17 years old at the time, he received a mandatory life sentence with his earliest parole eligibility set for the year 2048, meaning he faces at least 41 years behind bars before tasting freedom. Fading quietly into obscurity, both cases likely would have stayed forgotten if a groundbreaking Netflix documentary series hadn't premiered in December 2015. Making a Murderer, crafted over a decade by filmmakers Moira Demos and Laura Ricciardi, meticulously dissected the entire investigation and trial. Turning into a massive global pop culture phenomenon, the 10-episode series transformed millions of viewers into armchair detectives analyzing evidence, questioning the integrity of the convictions, and sparking deep anxieties about systemic flaws within the American justice system. Exploding into a fierce public debate, supporters argued the film exposed massive holes in the state's timeline and blatant police misconduct. On the flip side, critics including lead prosecutor Ken Kratz and Teresa's grieving family condemned the documentary as a heavily biased, one-sided piece of media that intentionally omitted critical evidence pointing to the defendant's guilt. Amassing over 500,000 signatures, a massive White House petition demanded a presidential pardon for Avery, prompting an official response noting that a sitting U.S. president possesses zero constitutional authority to pardon state-level convictions. Dassey's specific plight garnered intense empathy, heavily fueled by the raw, uncomfortable interrogation footage showcased in the series. August 2016 brought a shocking twist when a federal judge ruled Dassey's confession unconstitutionally coerced, overturning his conviction and ordering his immediate release within 90 days unless the state launched a formal appeal. State officials immediately launched an appeal against this ruling. Round and round the case went through the appellate courts, with a 3-judge panel initially ruling in Brendan's favor in June 2017, only for the full 7th Circuit Court of Appeals to reverse that victory 6 months later, upholding his conviction in a razor-thin 4-3 vote. June 2018 saw the U.S. Supreme Court decline to hear Brendan's appeal, effectively exhausting his options in the federal court system. Led by the Center on Wrongful Convictions of Youth at Northwestern University, Brendan's legal team shifted gears to petition Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers for executive clemency. However, December 2019 brought a definitive denial from the governor, who ruled that Brendan did not meet the criteria for a pardon or commutation, highlighting the tragic reality that Brendan remains caged solely based on a single confession given when he was a 16-year-old boy, gifted with limited cognitive abilities and completely deprived of an attorney or parent. His defenders brand it a classic coerced confession that is totally contradicted by zero physical evidence linking him to the scene. Meanwhile, Steven Avery continues his relentless post-conviction battle through high-profile attorney Kathleen Zellner. August 2022 brought a massive filing from Zellner, introducing a mountain of new evidence pointing the finger at a third-party suspect, one of Avery's own nephews from the Dassey family. Forensic analysis of a family computer uncovered highly disturbing, violent search histories, she alleged, while pointing to a new eyewitness who placed this individual near Teresa's vehicle, suggesting a calculated setup to frame Avery. Yet, every court has flatly rejected these arguments so far, with the Wisconsin Court of Appeals most recently affirming the denial in January 2025. Today, both Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey remain behind bars. Now past his 60th year, Avery spends his life sentence tirelessly filing new legal motions, while Brendan, just 16 when Teresa died, won't even see a parole board until he turns 63 in 2048. Dividing the nation, their saga stands as one of the most polarizing and fiercely debated criminal cases in American history, with passionate supporters on both sides arguing day and night over guilt, innocence, and systemic fairness. Privacy remains the constant plea of the Halbach family, who express deep exhaustion and frustration with the endless media circus, expressing that the ongoing documentaries and relentless appeals simply rip open unhealed wounds while disrespecting Teresa's memory. For them, true justice was fully served back in 2007, but for others, the case leaves burning questions about police interrogation tactics, prosecutorial conduct, and the utter vulnerability of a defendant facing the crushing weight of the state. Whether the ultimate truth lies in the jury's verdict or inside the deep doubts raised by appellate lawyers may never be settled, cementing the Avery Dassey case as an eternal symbol of the messy complexity of justice. Yet, while that debate raged on, another Wisconsin husband was preparing to face a second full trial for an old crime. Mark Jensen anchors our 8th story. Written a mere 2 weeks before her death, a single letter became the most legally contested piece of evidence in Wisconsin history, forcing a man to stand trial twice for the exact same murder. Those 2 courtroom battles were separated by a staggering 25 years. 38-year-old Mark Jensen called police on December 3, 1998, hysterically reporting that he just found his wife Julie unresponsive in bed at their home in Pleasant Prairie, right on the southern edge of Kenosha. Appearing as if she were in a deep, peaceful sleep, 40-year-old Julie Jensen was actually dead. Initial autopsy findings were completely inconclusive, leaving medical examiners entirely baffled as to how or why she died, causing the investigation to stall out for months. Refusing to throw in the towel, detectives seized the family's desktop computer and hit a chilling discovery. At exactly 9:42 a.m. on the day Julie died, someone used that computer to search for unconsciousness caused by ethylene glycol poisoning. Ethylene glycol, the main ingredient in automotive antifreeze, is an exceptionally toxic chemical capable of killing a human in small doses if ingested. Advanced toxicological screenings later revealed that Julie's blood, stomach, and urine were completely saturated with this deadly antifreeze, prompting the medical examiner to rule her death a homicide caused by poisoning and smothering. Digging deeper, investigators unmasked a dark, crumbling marriage beneath the family's pleasant exterior. Looking like a model couple from the outside, Mark and Julie were busy raising their 2 young sons. Behind closed doors, however, their relationship had been rotting away for several years, stretching back to the early 1990s. Julie had previously strayed in an affair, a betrayal Mark could never forgive. Friends and co-workers later testified that Mark was consumed by a deep-seated hatred, becoming completely obsessed with inflicting psychological torture upon Julie. Conducting a multi-year campaign of terror, he allegedly made anonymous hounding calls, sent threatening emails, left pornography around the house for her to find, and meticulously logged her every move in a personal planner. Making her appear mentally unstable was a calculated framing effort Julie grew increasingly terrified of as she read his diary entries. Mental health struggles took a massive toll on Julie, driving her to therapy sessions for severe depression, heavy with the knowledge that Mark was actively carrying on an affair with a co-worker named Kelly Leonte Greeman. Overwhelmed by terror, Julie took a fateful step in late November 1998, just days before her death, by drafting a letter to local police. Attaching a photograph of a highly suspicious list she uncovered in Mark's planner, she detailed her darkest fears. She told a neighbor she suspected Mark was planning something terrible. "If anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect," Julie penned. "I pray I'm wrong, plus nothing happens. But I am suspicious of Mark's suspicious behaviors plus fear for my early demise." Sealing the documents inside an envelope, she handed them over to her neighbor with an urgent directive. "If anything happens to me, give this to the police." Leaving multiple voicemail messages for authorities voicing the exact same fears, emphasizing that she harbored absolutely zero suicidal thoughts was her main priority. Charging Mark Jensen with murder in 2002, 4 years after Julie's death, prosecutors turned that prophetic letter into the absolute centerpiece of their case, arguing Mark covertly poisoned Julie with antifreeze over several days, panicking when the toxic dose failed to kill her fast enough. Testifying to a chilling admission, a jailhouse informant confessed that Mark bragged about seeing Julie's breathing improve, prompting him to ruthlessly flip her over and suffocate her with a pillow. Eliminating his wife cleared a path for him to openly date Kelly, whom he later married and who took custody of his 2 sons after his eventual arrest. Firing back, Mark's defense team claimed Julie was a deeply unstable woman who committed suicide to frame her husband from beyond the grave, pointing to her depression, therapy visits, and knowledge of Mark's affair. They offered her mental state as proof of self-harm. Moving the high-profile case to Walworth County due to massive media scrutiny, the official trial opened in 2008, dragging on for 27 grueling days. Facing a critical constitutional battle over whether Julie's letter and voicemails could even be admitted, courts ruled them admissible under the legal doctrine of forfeiture by wrongdoing, a principle stating a defendant cannot benefit from murdering a witness to silence them. Finding Mark Jensen guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, the jury left Judge Bruce Schroeder to hand down a mandatory life sentence without parole. Ending the saga was far from over, as Mark's appellate team launched relentless challenges against the admission of Julie's letter, arguing it directly violated his Sixth Amendment Confrontation Clause right to cross-examine his accuser. Dead and unable to take the stand, Julie could never be questioned by Mark, making the letter inadmissible hearsay that should have been barred. Bouncing through the Wisconsin judicial system, this high-stakes legal warfare climbed all the way to the state Supreme Court and became deeply entangled with evolving landmark U.S. Supreme Court rulings on testimonial evidence. Agreeing with the defense, U.S. District Judge William Griesbach overturned Mark's conviction in 2013, ruling that admitting Julie's voice from the grave violated constitutional protections and was not a harmless error. Gearing up for a massive legal battle, the state immediately prepared to try him all over again. Endurance was tested through years of procedural gridlock, including a judge reinstating the conviction without a trial, only to be slapped down by the Wisconsin Supreme Court before a fresh trial date was finally locked in for January 2023. Facing an uphill battle, prosecutors had to secure a conviction entirely without the aid of Julie's prophetic letter or voicemails, the very items first trial jurors explicitly cited as the keys to their guilty verdict. Lead prosecutor Robert Jamba, who spearheaded the original trial, returned to construct a powerful circumstantial case using other clues. Showcasing the desktop computer search history, the lethal levels of ethylene glycol in Julie's tissues, testimonies from Mark's co-workers about his poisoning discussions, and the chilling admissions detailed by the jailhouse informant, the state built an ironclad timeline, calling Kelly Labonte, Mark's long-divorced second wife. To the stand was another strategic move by the state, having her testify about their past affair and Mark's behavior. Defense attorney Mackenzie Reener countered that Julie was an unreliable narrator who spun conflicting stories about her marriage, arguing Mark was simply a bad husband rather than a cold-blooded killer. Taking less than a single day to deliberate after listening to 15 days of testimony, the jury returned a unanimous verdict on February 11, 2023. Guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, marking the second time in 2 decades that Mark Jensen was convicted of poisoning his wife. His sentencing unfolded on April 14, 2023, before Judge Anthony Milisauskas, the third Kenosha County judge to preside over this historic case. Begging the court for a chance at parole after 20 years, his attorneys noted he had already served 15 years since his initial conviction, but Judge Milisauskas flatly rejected the request, citing the overwhelming evidence of guilt along with the calculated, prolonged cruelty of the crime. Exposing how Mark psychologically tortured Julie for years before researching how to kill her, the judge highlighted how he poisoned her over several days and coldly watched her writhe in agony. This was a long-planned crime. It was intentional. It was researched for evil purposes, the judge declared, leaving him with zero chance of early release. Facing a mandatory life sentence without parole for the second time in his life, Mark Jensen was sent back to Dodge Correctional Institution in Walpun, where he had already spent the last decade and a half. Declaring his intention to appeal this second conviction, he fiercely maintained his innocence, insisting Julie orchestrated an elaborate setup to frame him before taking her own life. Bringing much-needed closure to Julie's family after decades of navigating legal limbo, this second verdict cemented his fate. Delivering tearful victim impact statements regarding the toll of the crime, her 3 brothers recounted the permanent grief of losing their sister and the sheer exhaustion of watching the case drag on for a quarter of a century. Noting that Mark had never shown a single shred of genuine remorse, Prosecutor Jamba added that he never apologized or took accountability. Today, Mark Jensen remains rotting behind bars, his name forever tied to one of the most complex legal epics in Wisconsin history, a landmark case where true justice required 20 years, 2 full trials, and 2 life sentences to finally be served. Yet, while Mark Jensen's crime unfolded through years of meticulous calculation, another Wisconsin monster quietly sowed terror in the shadows for over 2 decades before advanced DNA technology finally caught up to unmask him. Walter Ellis anchors our 9th story, where for 21 years women on Milwaukee's North Side vanished, only to be found dead, strangled to death and callously dumped in tight alleys, abandoned homes, or along neighborhood walkways while the killer walked free. Born June 24, 1960, in Holmes County, Mississippi, Walter Earl Ellis was the 4th of 6 children in a family that relocated to Milwaukee's North Side during his early childhood years. Displaying erratic, impulsive, aggressive, and highly violent behavior toward his peers from a young age, Ellis routinely assaulted classmates and neighborhood kids, establishing a brutal pattern that steadily escalated as he grew older. Entering his teenage years, he kicked off a multi-decade criminal career, racking up dozens of arrests for battery, burglary, drug distribution, and domestic violence, building a massive rap sheet long before his first recorded murder. Assaulting a police officer during a 1986 arrest for disorderly conduct earned him a 7-month county jail sentence. Released in May 1987, he was almost immediately re-jailed for theft, followed by a 1988 conviction for operating a vehicle without consent after assaulting another arresting officer. Tangling with a drug ring by 1990, he landed a federal prison sentence in Milwaukee for cocaine distribution. Violating parole repeatedly throughout the 90s, he abused multiple girlfriends, even severely stabbing one with a screwdriver, yet routinely evaded harsh sentences by serving as a registered police informant. That flagrant protection finally dissolved in 1998, when fresh charges caused handlers to sever ties, sending him to Oshkosh Correctional Institution for 3 years before his release in July 2001. Hidden perfectly beneath the chaos of his paper trail, however, his most horrific crimes had already quietly begun years prior. October 10, 1986, brought a horrific discovery when the body of 31-year-old Deborah Harris was pulled from the Milwaukee River, strangled to death. The very next day, October 11, 1986, authorities found 19-year-old Tanya Miller, who had also been brutally strangled. Both women were African American. Bearing signs of severe physical abuse, both victims were left in secluded spots that explicitly demonstrated the killer's deep, intimate knowledge of the city's north side. Suspecting a connection between the two deaths, investigators lacked the advanced forensic tools necessary to prove it. Over the next 2 decades, 5 more women fell victim to the exact same terrifying, predictable pattern. 25-year-old Irene Smith was murdered in November 1992, followed by 28-year-old Florence McCormick in April 1995. 37-year-old Sheila Farrier vanished in June 1995. 41-year-old Joyce Mims in June 1997, and 28-year-old Wallow Stokes in April 2007. Targeting exclusively black women ranging in age from 19 to 41, the killer choked them all, either manually with bare hands or by using tight ligatures like ropes or cloth. Most of the victims struggled with high-risk lifestyles on the streets, making them vulnerable targets whose bodies were callously dumped in vacant homes, narrow alleys, and overgrown areas across Milwaukee's north side. Year after year, detectives worked each individual murder case in total isolation, entirely unaware that they were actually hunting a single, prolific serial killer. Milwaukee Police Homicide Detective Stephen Spingola, who personally investigated the Farrier and McCormick cases, even drafted a highly detailed criminal profile of the suspect that colleagues later called chillingly accurate. Retiring before the big breakthrough in the investigation materialized, Spingola watched as the cases quietly sat on shelves collecting dust. That historic turning point finally arrived in May 2009, when the Milwaukee Police Cold Case Unit, led by detectives Gilbert Hernandez and Kathy Hine, decided to pull the old files and re-examine the physical evidence using advanced DNA testing. Finding a perfect genetic profile match linking all 7 homicides together sent shockwaves through the department, proving a single killer left biological evidence on every victim. Identifying the owner of that specific DNA profile among a massive pool of suspects became their urgent mission. A breakthrough lead eventually came from an unexpected source, a 2002 felony battery conviction that legally should have landed Ellis's DNA sample into the Wisconsin state database years prior. Slipping through critical cracks in the state's flawed collection and verification system, his reference sample was never properly uploaded or cross-checked. Rectifying the bureaucratic error in 2009, investigators ran a decisive database search that yielded an undeniable slam-shut match. Matching perfectly with the physical evidence recovered from 7 different crime scenes spanning 21 years, Walter Ellis was cornered on September 7, 2009, at a motel in Franklin, Wisconsin, where he was hiding out with his 54-year-old girlfriend, who remained completely oblivious to his horrific criminal history. Engaging in a brief, desperate scuffle with arresting officers before being secured in handcuffs, he was found in possession of a small amount of methamphetamine and drug paraphernalia. Arraigned initially on 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide for the deaths of Mims and Stokes, Ellis faced 5 additional formal murder charges from prosecutors just days later, bringing the grand total of homicide counts to 7. Building an absolutely ironclad case, the state possessed unassailable evidence against him. Semen samples recovered from the victims' bodies provided a flawless match to Ellis's genetic profile, while the method of ligature and manual strangulation remained identical across all scenes. Mapping out the body dump locations across the north side of Milwaukee revealed a perfect overlay with neighborhoods where Ellis lived, worked, and frequented. Staring down the mountain of forensic evidence, Ellis's defense team advised him to accept a plea deal to avoid the risk of a trial. Entering a plea of no contest to all 7 counts of first-degree intentional homicide in February 2011, he bypassed a public trial entirely, leading Judge Dennis Simple to sentence him on February 24, 2011, to 7 consecutive life terms without parole. Delivering tearful, agonizing victim impact statements during that sentencing hearing, several grieving family members openly condemned Ellis as pure evil. Expressing a bitter wish that Wisconsin still utilized the death penalty, others wept openly as they implored the court to remember the victims not as nameless statistics, but as loving mothers, daughters, and sisters whose complex lifestyles never diminished their humanity or made their violent deaths acceptable. Sitting motionless like a stone block throughout the entire proceeding, Ellis maintained a cold, expressionless face as relatives recounted over 2 decades of profound grief and unanswered questions. Ruling that the sole mitigating factor sparing the families the exhaustion of a trial paled in comparison to the sheer gravity of his heinous crimes, Judge Simple made it absolutely clear that Ellis would die behind bars, with 0 chance of ever breathing free air again. Transferred under a federal interstate compact agreement following his conviction, Ellis was sent to serve out his life terms at the South Dakota State Penitentiary in Sioux Falls. Suffering a rapid, severe decline in his physical health, he was diagnosed with advanced diabetic complications alongside multiple chronic ailments, prompting a transfer to a specialized medical prison unit where, on December 1, 2013, having served less than 3 years of his sentence, Walter Ellis drew his final breath at the age of 53. While his death brought a small measure of closure to the families of the deceased, it simultaneously exposed glaring systemic failures, revealing how massive gaps in the management of Wisconsin's DNA database inadvertently allowed a monster like Ellis to walk free for over 2 decades despite multiple arrests. Authorities later discovered that at least 2 other men had been wrongfully convicted of murders that were actually committed by Ellis. One of them was Shante Ott, who was convicted in 1996 based solely on the testimony of a jailhouse informant for the death of Jessica Payne, a murder that subsequent DNA testing proved was actually perpetrated by Ellis. The landmark Ellis saga catalyzed sweeping reforms in the way the state of Wisconsin collects, cross-references, and preserves DNA samples from convicted felons, while igniting painful discussions regarding the extreme vulnerability of marginalized communities. It highlighted how victims pushed to the fringes of society and labeled as high risk frequently received minimal investigative attention until the repetitive nature of the crimes became impossible to ignore. Today, the name Walter Ellis remains a dark shadow tied to one of the longest-running serial murder cases in Milwaukee history, a painful reminder that delayed justice ultimately means justice denied for so many innocent victims. Yet, just as Ellis's decades-long reign of terror drew to a close, another tragedy was preparing to strike Milwaukee, a case that would shock the nation and raise urgent questions regarding dating violence and youth safety in the digital era. Our 10th story, Maxwell Anderson, centers on a first date that began with drinks and laughter but ended with the dismembered remains of a young girl scattered across Milwaukee, leaving the entire city stunned and fiercely demanding answers as to how such a horror could take place. 33 years old in April 2024, Maxwell Anderson was working as a bartender in Milwaukee and living in a South Side apartment, while 19-year-old Sade Robinson was a student at Milwaukee Area Technical College, juggling 2 jobs to afford tuition. Growing up in adversity and facing countless challenges, she remained determined to build a successful life on her own terms. Driven by a fierce independence, the 2 crossed paths at a bar in late March and scheduled a date for April 1st, with surveillance cameras capturing them entering the Twisted Fisherman's seafood restaurant on West Canal Street that evening. Spending several hours drinking at 2 different bars, they eventually headed back to Anderson's apartment together. What happened next could only be pieced together through digital evidence, witness testimonies, and a series of gruesome discoveries that steadily came to light, including photographs found on Anderson's phone showing him groping Sade as she lay face down, unresponsive on his sofa. Prosecutors argued that she was completely unconscious at that point and entirely unable to defend herself. In the early morning hours of April 2nd, Security footage tracked her car leaving his apartment and driving directly toward Warnemont Park in Cudahy, a scenic location situated right along the shores of Lake Michigan. This was where Anderson ruthlessly dismembered the poor girl's body, prosecutors asserted, before Sade's car was discovered torched behind an abandoned house later that morning. Camera footage showed Anderson casually walking away from the scene to catch a city bus home, his clothes appearing perfectly clean despite the horrific crime prosecutors accused him of just committing. That very afternoon, a passerby made a horrifying discovery. A severed human leg, cut from the hip, discarded among the rocks at the bottom of a cliff in Warnemont Park. 4 days later, a human foot was discovered near the intersection of 31st and Galena Streets in Milwaukee's Walnut Hill neighborhood. By April 18th, a human torso and arm washed ashore on a secluded stretch of beach in South Milwaukee. Weeks later, another arm believed to belong to Sade was discovered at Waukegan Municipal Beach in Illinois, a staggering 53 miles away from Milwaukee, though her head remains completely missing to this day. On April 2nd, when friends could not reach her, they frantically reported her missing, leading the Milwaukee County Sheriff's Office to pull Anderson over during a routine traffic stop on April 4th and place him under arrest. Moving at a rapid pace, the investigation deepened as evidence mounted from surveillance footage, location data, and the illicit photos on his phone, to the physical evidence tying him directly to the crime scenes. Searching his trunk, investigators were horrified to discover multiple saw blades, shears, heavy-duty loppers, and a blood-soaked tarp containing Sade's blood. Anderson was formally charged with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, arson of property, and hiding a corpse. Maintaining his innocence, he entered a plea of not guilty throughout the legal proceedings, steadfastly arguing that a mysterious attacker must have kidnapped Sade after she left his apartment. His trial officially opened in late May 2025, where prosecutors laid out a meticulously constructed case demonstrating Anderson's window of opportunity alongside the damning physical evidence tying him to the dismemberment, and his calculated steps to destroy evidence by torching her vehicle. Assistant District Attorney Ian Vance Quester emphasized the absolute brutality of this crime during his closing arguments. "What kind of person ruthlessly decapitates another human being?" he forcefully asked the jury. "Only a killer desperately trying to escape justice." Anderson's attorney, Tony Cotton, fiercely argued that the prosecution failed to prove Anderson intentionally took Sade's life, a mandatory element for a first-degree intentional homicide conviction. He pointed out that absolutely no one heard any signs of a struggle or altercation coming from Anderson's apartment, that Anderson made zero attempt to conceal his identity when boarding the city bus, and that his clothes appeared perfectly clean when captured on camera shortly after the alleged dismemberment. Cotton argued that the entire case was merely circumstantial and lacked sufficient weight, but the jury completely disagreed. On June 6, 2025, following just 45 minutes of deliberation over 2 days after listening to 15 days of testimony, they returned a unanimous verdict, convicting Anderson on all counts. Bringing a wave of relief, the verdict could never truly heal the profound grief shattering Sade's family. Her mother, Sheena Scarborough, tearfully told reporters after the trial, "There is no such thing as complete justice. We've lost her forever." The official sentencing hearing took place on August 1, 2025. Judge Laura Crivello repeatedly questioned how a human being could ruthlessly commit such an abhorrent crime, branding it one of the most horrific murders I have ever witnessed in this courtroom. Grieving family members delivered tearful victim impact statements detailing the devastating toll of the crime. Sade's 16-year-old sister, Adriana Reams, choked back tears as she recounted holding up her collapsing mother while quietly enduring her own agonizing heartbreak. She spoke of horrors no teenager should ever endure. From constantly communicating with law enforcement to caring for family members too shattered to function, all while trying to accept the brutal reality that she lost her protective older sister and lifelong role model. "What he did goes beyond murder and dismemberment," Adriana stated through her tears. "He erased her independence, erased her ability to fight back. He intentionally stripped away her existence and her humanity." Sade's father, Carlos Robinson, begged the judge that Anderson deserved the exact same cruel fate he inflicted on Sade. "Everything he did to my daughter should be done to his body," he said. "No one deserves to live after doing what he did." Said's mother glared directly at Anderson with pure fury, her voice trembling with profound pain and intense anger. "You planned and plotted to murder, dismember, and ruthlessly scatter my daughter's body parts across Milwaukee like trash." Scarborough wept. "Your Honor, I beg you to send this monster back to hell where he belongs. He needs to be locked away with the rest of the demons who hurt human beings." Anderson's attorney pleaded with the court to grant him eligibility for parole after 25 years, citing his past service in the Navy and arguing he deserved an opportunity for rehabilitation. But Judge Crivello remained entirely unmoved by those pleas, pointing to Anderson's total refusal to accept responsibility throughout the trial, his stubborn denial of where he hid the rest of Said's remains, and his defiant insistence on his innocence despite an unassailable mountain of evidence against him. "It is beyond comprehension for parents to not know if their child is alive or dead, only to discover she was dismembered and desecrated," the judge said, her voice trailing off as she shook her head in disbelief. Branding his actions utterly unconscionable, she likened the case to a real-life horror novel. Concluding that Anderson was beyond redemption, Judge Crivello handed down a mandatory life sentence without parole for the murder charge, plus an additional 7.5 years for mutilating a corpse and 18 months for arson. Ordering all sentences to be served consecutively, she dismissed the charge of hiding a corpse after Anderson's defense team successfully argued that Wisconsin law prohibits concurrent convictions for both mutilating and hiding a corpse arising from the same conduct. Vowing to launch an appeal, Anderson spoke briefly at the sentencing, asserting that true justice would prevail and claiming he was wrongfully convicted. Yet for the family of Said Robinson, the formal legal proceedings brought a sense of finality. Milwaukee Area Technical College posthumously awarded Said her associate degree in May 2024, honoring the dedicated academic journey the young woman was tragically prevented from completing. Today, Maxwell Anderson remains locked away in a Wisconsin prison, his name forever serving as a dark symbol of one of the most brutal and senseless crimes in the state's modern history. Meanwhile, Said Robinson's family continues their relentless search for her remaining missing remains, knowing deep down that until they can lay her fully to rest, their nightmare will never truly end. Her tearful story instantly transformed into a powerful rallying cry for social activists working tirelessly to combat violence against young Black women victims whose cases historically receive far less media attention or dedicated police investigative resources. Said Robinson will always be remembered, not for the horrific way her life was stolen, but for her fierce determination, her resilience, and the bright future that was ruthlessly ripped away from her on what should have been an ordinary first date.